me formally introduce everyone to Professor Lindsey Kingston from Webster University. I just got a chance to meet Professor Kingston myself for the first time, but we've been in touch over email. And we were introduced by Elizabeth Cohen, who will be our future colleague here at BU next year. And so it's a really exciting introduction that was made, and hopefully be able to hear a lot more about her research. I look forward to our conversation on this timely and wonderful topic. So please, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the warm welcome. It's really nice to be back on campus. I actually graduated from BU in 2002, which, whoa, saying that out loud is a long time ago. But I was a first-generation college student, so it's really cool to be back here as a tenured professor with a PhD and a book. So it's very meaningful to me, so thank you for being here. I am here today, of course, to talk about my book, Fully Human, but really more than that, to have a conversation with you about how it is that we recognize people as being worthy of fundamental human rights protections. A lot of times when we talk about human rights abuses, we like to point fingers at things like discrimination and hatred, or maybe even evil. We use that word evil sometimes. We talk about things like competition for resources. And often that's partly true. That's part of the conversation, but that's not all of it. And so what I try to do in this book is I try to call attention to something that we don't talk about very much, and that is structural inadequacy in our international human rights regime. I'm trying to make the case here that it's not just bad actors or human behavior, but it's actually a structural problem that we've built into the international community. Okay, so in particular, there's two things. One is that we are in a very state-centric system. So that means governments are the units with which we organize our international community. And that is really important for human rights because we talk about governments being the duty bearers of human rights, which I'm going to talk about in a second. The other thing is that we really put a lot of importance on citizenship. We use this as a category to recognize human rights claimants and to kind of assign people to a government. You're a citizen here, which means you belong to this government and they're supposed to look out for you. And these things are problematic for all sorts of reasons that we're going to talk about today. But really, at the end of the day, what this means is that this system, this structure that we've created, has left millions of people vulnerable to falling into these protection gaps and suffering all sorts of human rights abuse. All right. So I know that we're probably at different levels of studying human rights. Maybe this is old hat to you, or maybe this is new. So I want to make sure we're using some of the terms in the same way. All right, so really quick marathon version of human rights. So after the World Wars, after the Holocaust, the international community and the newly formed UN came together and said, we have to have some standards by which to hold governments accountable for the people within their territories. And so from that came the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR, and international human rights law. So this stuff is important for our conversation today for a few reasons, and I want to make sure we're clear on this. One, international human rights frameworks and laws focus on governments, okay? So unless some of you are like presidents of a country or royalty or something I don't know about, you can't be a human rights violator. You can be a criminal and you can be punished as a criminal, but you can't be a human rights violator because that's the territory of governments. So presidents and prime ministers and heads of military or police, those sorts of people and institutions. And so this is important too because by focusing on governments, what we're saying is governments are responsible for us little people, us individuals. They're supposed to uphold certain rights, like providing, rights to basic education, and they're also supposed to prevent our rights from being violated, like being tortured, for example. And so that means governments are the duty bearers. They're the ones responsible for these basic protections. So that's part of it. The other part is that human rights are universal. So this means that we have them because we're human, full stop. If you're born human, welcome to the club. You're supposed to have human rights. The third is that they're inalienable. So nothing you can do or say or believe is supposed to be able to take them away or cancel them out. So you don't have to be a good person to have human rights. You don't even have to be a law-abiding person to have human rights. You could be the nastiest of the nasty. It doesn't matter. The government doesn't have the right to do things like torture you. So governments are the duty bearers of human rights. Human rights are universal and inalienable. Are we all on the same page so far? Great. So when I look at the UDHR, when I look at this blueprint of modern human rights, I see all sorts of different things that are supposed to be the bare minimum necessities for living a life of human dignity. So human rights is not about making you have the life of a rock star, but it's also not about just keeping you alive. Human rights don't end with making sure you have food and oxygen, okay? It's supposed to be a life of human dignity. So you have at least a decent shot at being happy, basically. It's a really simple way of putting it. So when I look at the UDHR and these basic protections, I see a lot of things falling into categories that I can say either fit into the rights to place or the rights to purpose. Now, they're connected really importantly. So the rights to place could be rights to place in terms of like the ground we're standing on. So things like the right to have nationality, the right to not worry about being picked up by immigration police and put in detention or not being deported. It's also rights to safety. I want to be able to walk home after this talk or walk to class and not worry about suffering from violence on my way. These are the things that kind of make sure that we have safety and we're able to stay in our place. But it's also about things like being part of a society and part of culture. So this might be things like being able to own property and having a home, being able to participate in government, things like running for office or voting. And these rights to place are really, really important because if you don't have them or if they're under threat, it's really, really hard to go about a life of human dignity and to enjoy what I call rights to purpose. Right? So if human rights are not just about staying alive and breathing and eating, although eating is part of my right to purpose, I'm not going to lie, we have to be confident in our rights to place. So everybody's going to have a different idea of what it means to have purpose in life. It might be pursuing your education and your career, having a family, participating in government or religion, having your freedom of expression and engaging in art, all sorts of different things. But it's really hard to do any of these things focused on your rights to purpose if you're scared all the time of violence or deportation or imprisonment, right? So these things are very much connected because one follows from the other. So that is my very Cliff's Notes version of human rights. Are we still okay? Awesome. Okay, so we have all of these really beautiful norms in the UDHR and international human rights law, and yet you don't have to be a human rights scholar to know that these rights are violated all the time, all around the world. So clearly, we have some problems here. After the Holocaust and World War II, we said never again. And yet we continue to have genocides all around the world every single decade. We continue to see forced displacement and ethnic cleansing, and the list goes on and on and on. So I think for myself and for any human rights scholar, the question always comes up of why? How, when we built this framework that was supposed to stop so much of this, how do we still have this happening? How is never again not actually being practiced? So I've been thinking about this for a while, and one of the things that I spend a lot of time doing is talking to people. I was a journalism major at BU, so I like talking and listening to people. And I'm a firm believer that people are the best experts in their own lives. They're the experts on what they're going through, what they need, what they're experiencing. And so for any of you who want to be social scientists, who want to engage in research, I hope you realize that your number one goal is to listen to people and to take them seriously. And so I love to travel. That's my other thing. And so I travel around the world and I spend a lot of time listening to people. And I started to notice things in all of these conversations. So let me give you a few examples. This is a picture of an Inuk man in the Canadian Arctic territory of Nunavut. And up in Nunavut, there are all of these amazing Inuit social movement leaders who have basically negotiated the land claims agreement with the government of Canada to have self-governance rights and also rights to things like hunting and fishing. And so this is a really interesting example because you have people that have a very unique balancing act with their government, right? they are on Canadian territory, and yet they are in certain ways distinct from the Canadian population. And so this is tricky terrain because if Canada is their duty bearer, they're also negotiating with Canada as a separate entity. And so their Canadian citizenship and their membership in that community is different than somebody who is a settler Canadian or has settler citizenship. Oops. This is a picture from the Amazon rainforest in Brazil. This little girl is indigenous, and her community is in a very difficult position because many members of her federal government see indigenous peoples as a challenge or an impediment to Brazil's modernization and to its economic success. So here you have people who have been in Brazil for longer than most other Brazilians, and yet they're being painted as enemies of the state and a problem for their own community. Completely unrelated, I want you to know that this sloth's name was Stephanie. I did not name the sloth, she did. I just thought that was fantastic. This is a picture from the East African country of Rwanda, where if you know anything about Rwanda, you probably know that in 1994, it experienced a horrific genocide over the course of 100 days. And in Rwanda, your government-issued ID card often meant the difference between whether you lived or whether you died, because they had categories for your ethnicity. So you might get stopped at a roadside checkpoint, and whether it said Hutu or Tutsi on your government-issue ID card could determine whether you got to continue driving along or whether you would be killed right there at the side of the road. So this leads to all sorts of questions about how documentation can be used as a weapon, but also it raises the question of what does it mean to be Rwandan, or what does it mean to have any national identity, especially when your government might see part of its population as an enemy that needs to be exterminated. This is a picture of people who are Rohingya. They're a Muslim minority in the country of Myanmar, also known as Burma, and they are fleeing genocide in this picture, headed to Bangladesh. So these are folks who were targeted not only by neighbors and members of the Buddhist community, but also by police forces and by the Burmese military. And this is a long process. In the early 1980s, the government basically decided that all Rohingya who had Burmese citizenship were no longer citizens. They said, you are not good enough, you do not count as Burmese, now we're going to say that you're illegal immigrants and foreigners, and they just took people's citizenship away. And that was part of this process of dehumanizing them and saying that they're not good enough to be part of our society. That has now, of course, resulted in actual physical genocide. And lastly, this is a picture from Serbia. The Balkans suffered from civil war and genocide of their own in the late 1990s. And now that's a place where a lot of people fleeing conflict, like the Syrian civil war, are trying to pass through on their way to Europe to seek asylum. So this is a part of the world where folks are very much familiar with what happens when you can't rely on your government to protect you, or when your government actually sees you as a threat or as an enemy. And folks there talk a lot about how the international community is supposed to step in these cases, right? We do have some stopgaps. We have things like the 1951 Refugee Convention that says, okay, if your government's the bad guy or can't help you, the rest of the world is supposed to step in and be that duty bearer for you. Except governments talk a lot about setting caps on how many refugees they're going to let in. They play games making sure people can't claim asylum. They don't want refugees in their territory. And so here we see how these protections that are supposed to be in place just in case, they're not panning out in practice. They're not fulfilling those protection gap needs. So when you're looking at this, you might be thinking, these are really dissimilar cases. These are different places around the world, different cultures and societies. They're not connected, but I very much think that they are. Because in all of these cases, we see what happens when that relationship with your state breaks down or doesn't exist. And the reality is, if you don't have that relationship, you're in a really, really tight spot because you have no one to stand up for you, no one to claim you as their own and to protect your human rights. So in my work, I talk about this concept of functioning citizenship, which is not just a piece of paper. It's not just being able to have an ID card or a passport. It's a lot more than that. I write that functioning citizenship requires an active and mutually beneficial relationship between the state and the individual, which basically means you have a relationship with your government, and a good one, not a toxic one, a good relationship. If any of you have studied social contract thinkers, you get a little sense of what I'm talking about here, right? If we're talking about the social contract, we say, we have a contract with the state. We're supposed to do certain things. We're supposed to pay our taxes. We're supposed to follow the laws. We're supposed to vote and participate in government, be good citizens. And in exchange for that, the government does things for us, right? The police and military are supposed to protect us and keep us safe, not harm us, right? Where they're supposed to provide infrastructure like roads and schools and post offices. And they're supposed to be the duty bearers of our human rights. They're supposed to protect our rights and make sure other people don't infringe upon them, or other organizations or entities. So if that contract is upheld and you have that functioning relationship, you're doing really great. But a lot of people don't have that, and that's where things get really, really difficult. If you don't have this relationship with the government, then you stand to fall in a bad spot in what I call the hierarchies of personhood, right? So in a sense, this is kind of saying that some people are more worthy than human rights of others, or some people count more than others. And we know that there are some folks that have a much easier time enjoying their fundamental human rights than others. And so in a sense, this is really a comment on your humanity. If we're making the case that human rights are universal because you're human, you have human rights because you're human, but actually some people have more rights than others or enjoy more rights than others, what we're really saying is some people count more as fully human than others, hence the title of my book. And so this is part of, I think, that dehumanization process that perpetuates things like genocide and other human rights atrocities. So one of the things that I spend a lot of time working on is the issue of statelessness. And I think statelessness is a very stark example of what happens when somebody doesn't have functioning citizenship. So here it's really the whole bad package, okay? You don't have legal nationality. You don't have that ID card or passport or piece of paper to show that you're a citizen. But you also don't have that relationship. So it's like full lack of functioning citizenship. And so basically a stateless person is someone who doesn't have citizenship to any country in the world. And this might be surprising, especially to the folks that maybe grew up here in the United States. In the US, we have jus soli citizenship laws, which means if you're born on American soil, you're an American citizen. It doesn't matter who your parents are, why you're here, whatever, you're a US citizen. And so for a lot of us, the idea that somebody wouldn't have citizenship anywhere is really surprising. But this happens all around the world. There are millions of people who are stateless, and there are stateless people here in the United States. So this is problematic in lots of ways, one of which is that being stateless is a human rights violation in itself. You have the fundamental right to a nationality. But also, it's a root cause of further human rights violations. So if you don't have legal nationality, in a lot of places in the world, that means you can't protect those rights to place and purpose. So you can't often have a birth certificate or a marriage certificate or even a death certificate. You can't go to school. You can't work legally, so you're going to be open to poverty and vulnerable to things like human trafficking. You might not be able to go to the doctor. You can't get a passport. You can't travel. The list just goes on and on and on. So this is really one of those cases that highlights what it's like when you don't have a functioning relationship with the government, when you're trying to fall back on that idea of, well, I'm human, I must have human rights. But it doesn't work that way in political contexts. That's not how it plays out in the real world. And I'm not the first person to realize this, okay? This has been a conversation for a while now. After the World Wars, when the UN was created and we were creating this whole human rights system, Hannah Arendt kind of sounded the alarm bells. Hannah Arendt was a political theorist, but also a stateless refugee herself. And she was really, really troubled with this emphasis that we were placing on state governments and on citizenship. She wrote, "It turned out that the moment human beings lacked their own government and had to fall back upon their minimum rights, no authority was left to protect them and no institution was willing to guarantee them." So basically she's saying, what is the good of universal and inalienable human rights if you don't have a duty bearer willing to stand up for you or claim you? It's great. You can stand out there shouting about your rights all the time, but no one's going to uphold them. So this is a real problem. There are a lot of scholars, including Professor Cohen, who will be joining BU in the fall, who are really interested in what we call this citizenship binary. So Elizabeth Cohen argues that it's false to assume that citizenship is the natural guardian of human rights. And I argue that stateless people aren't just stateless by accident, right? It's used as a weapon against them. It's because they're discriminated against. It's this terrible cycle of marginalization. And it's really important to keep in mind that this binary is a false one. So often if you're reading the news about things like immigration, people like to assume that it's black and white, right? You're a citizen or you're a non-citizen. You're a national or you're a foreigner. And no, that's not how it works. And so we're trying to kind of push back on that. And unfortunately, this binary really continues in a lot of ways. So one example comes from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. They are wrapping up a 10-year global campaign that was aimed at eliminating statelessness around the world. Now I want to say, the folks at the UNHCR working on this are dedicated, brilliant, fabulous people that I have a lot of respect for. But there are some real flaws in this campaign, which I've told them about. They're really focusing on getting countries to sign on to our statelessness conventions, which is international law trying to prevent and eradicate statelessness, and also trying to make sure that everybody has legal nationality in the world. Legal nationality is not the same thing as functioning citizenship. So let me give you an example. There are stateless people in the country of Kuwait in the Middle East, and they're called the Badoon. So if you're Badoon in Kuwait, you have all sorts of trouble protecting your rights to place and purpose. You usually can't go to school, you can't work legally, you face poverty. When you get jobs, they're often under the table, and so there's unsafe working conditions, lots of bad stuff. So Kuwait was an issue for the UNHCR. They wanted to take care of this problem, to solve this problem. And so Kuwait negotiated a deal with this teeny tiny island nation called Comoros. Has anybody heard of Comoros? It's tiny. So if you were Badoon living in Kuwait, you would get this letter saying, congratulations, you are a citizen of Comoros. Woohoo, I'm not stateless anymore. Except this citizenship did not come with the right to live in Comoros or work in Comoros or participate in their government or basically have anything to do with the country of Comoros. All it did was literally give you a piece of paper saying you are not stateless anymore. Check, Kuwait is solved, right? You're still going to live in Kuwait and face all of those problems with your rights to place and purpose. Your life has not changed in any way except you literally have this useless piece of paper to, I don't know, put in your scrapbook, and that is it. And so this is a good example of how legal nationality without that functioning relationship is completely meaningless. So I can't cover everything from the book today, nor will I try, but what I really wanted to try to bring home was the fact that we can't rely on these binaries and that we have these structural problems, right? So if we think about citizenship not as you're a citizen or you're not a citizen, but as rather a spectrum, we can envision it in a lot of different ways. One is, think about statelessness on one end, right? This is your lack of legal nationality, but also this lack of relationship at all. On the other end, we have functioning citizenship. That's what we're aiming for. Not a lot of people have it, but that's what we want, okay? We have this contract being upheld, all puppies and rainbows and sunshine. So the thing is, though, between this non-citizen and the citizen, we have all of this gray space in between where so much human suffering actually happens. So that's what a lot of the book is about. So these are all chapters from the book that I think were really relevant. There are a lot of others that I could put in there and I'm happy to talk about, but you have to finish your book at some point, or at least that's what my editor tells me. So There are chapters on the forcibly displaced and irregular migrants. Now, these are separate chapters, but there's a ton of overlap here, all right? So forcibly displaced people are folks who have to flee their home because of genocide and war and things like that are covered under the Refugee Convention. But they often also have to flee because of things like the impacts of climate change, for example, or organized gang violence back home. So that's part of it, but then there are also people that we call irregular migrants, and these are people that have to leave for a whole bunch of different reasons. We often think about things like going for better jobs or better education, but the main thing is that these folks don't have the quote-unquote legal documentation to do so. They don't have the right visas in place to cross international borders, they don't have work permits, that sort of thing. The reason I say that these things are connected is because life is not super tidy, right? You might be moving for a variety of these reasons. You might be fleeing war and persecution, but also you would really like better pay and safer working conditions and a better schooling for your children. So a lot of times governments like to play games and say, oh, well, if you're going for those reasons, you can't qualify for asylum. But that's not how life works, right? And so we see this happening a lot on, say, the US-Mexico border right now. But the thing that connects these things together is the fact that these are people who cannot rely on their duty bearers. Most refugees have citizenship. They're not stateless people, but that doesn't mean that they have a relationship with their government. Maybe their government is actively trying to kill them or harm them. Maybe their government's the bad guy. But also there are cases where the government's not the bad guy, but they're also not a lot of help. Maybe they're too poor or politically powerless to be the efficient duty bearer. That happens too. So regardless of why, these are folks that can't count on their own government to protect them. And then things get really complicated as we go on. I have a chapter about nomadic peoples, and this is where things get even harder, I think, because these are folks that really don't fit in these categories we created with states and citizenship. So for a lot of nomadic peoples, like the Maasai in places like Tanzania and Kenya, which is the picture up there, these are people whose traditional lands were there before state borders. And so, later these state borders got plopped down after a war or whenever, and people might be having territories that are across 2 countries or 3 countries. So who's their duty bearer? Where do they belong? What's more than that, these folks are often pressured to become sedentary. Folks who settle down tend to look suspiciously on people who move, quote unquote, too much. And so there's a lot of pressure on them to change their lifestyle, to change their culture and to adapt, which is forced assimilation, right? If the message is you can have your rights if you totally become like us and stop doing what you're doing, that's forced assimilation. So it's not clear where these people belong in terms of duty bearers and citizenship, and it's also kind of forcibly assimilating them in order to stand up for their rights, which again, they're supposed to have them because they're human, not because they're citizens somewhere. Another chapter is about indigenous nations, and this just kind of keeps that conversation going even further. In the US, for example, indigenous nations have had treaty relationships with the US government. So they've been treated like sovereign states. The US State Department has negotiated treaties. So if you're a member of the Onondaga Nation, which is where this person's from, you can go to central New York, near Syracuse, New York, and enter a territory that's the Onondaga Nation, and you're actually leaving the United States of America when you set foot on the Onondaga Nation. So these are folks that still have bolts of cloth delivered to them from the US government every single year because that's what the treaty stipulates. I have no idea what they do with that cloth, side note. But for the longest time, members of the Onondaga Nation were traveling on their own passports, which is what this picture is of. They were able to go to places like Japan because they had sovereign government and the right to do this. But now, with increasing securitization of travel, suddenly they can't use those passports anymore. So the US and the Canadian governments have stepped in and said, don't worry about it. You're eligible for US or Canadian passports. You can just travel on those. And for some people, sure, that's fine. But for a lot of people, what that really means is you can take on this colonizer identity that you do not identify with, and then you can have your human rights to travel. So this is really, really problematic, right? These are folks that exist and have their main political identity outside of the state-centric political system, and our current system has no way of dealing with them. So it's not that any governments are actively trying to keep them from having their human rights. It's more of an administrative thing. We don't know what to do with these folks. They don't fit in these categories that we've pre-made. And the last chapter in terms of case studies in my book is about what I call second-class US citizenship. I think for a lot of people in the world, the idea of having American citizenship and an American passport is like winning the golden ticket. And the assumption is, everybody would benefit human rights-wise from having such a powerful citizenship. But I think it's really important to remember that these hierarchies of personhood exist in those spaces too. So I think for those of us who are paying attention and being honest with ourselves, we know that certain American citizens, especially Black and brown American citizens, are sometimes treated different by our government, especially when we're talking about spaces related to criminal justice and the policing of this country. And so I think that became even more apparent with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. I live in St. Louis. It's a center of that movement. And so I try to make the case here that we have threats to functioning citizenship even in these really politically powerful spaces. And so that happens here at home as well. In terms of what to do with all of this, I wish I could tell you I figured it all out in the book and I'm going to win the Nobel Peace Prize, but unfortunately I still have some work to do. But I try to tackle this in a few ways. One of which is kind of the practicalities of certain things. Because the reality is, if I'm talking with my friends who are stateless in the United States, and they're struggling to make ends meet because they can't work legally, and they can't travel to see their parents when they're dying in another country, and they can't even pick their kids up from daycare because they don't have government-issued ID. When I talk to these people and I say, let's talk about functioning citizenship, they maybe want to slap me in the face because they don't have time for theory, right? This is life, and they have things that they need right now. And so in the book, I talk about things like how we tell these stories, first of all, and making sure that we're listening to these people and amplifying their voices, but also how we tell these stories in a way where we really understand what's happening and we get to the meat of the problem. Sometimes there are things we can do to make life better. Things like trying to have universal birth registration so that every baby born in this world has a piece of paper that proves that they exist. It seems like a simple thing, but a lot of people don't have that, and it has repercussions for the rest of their lives. Sometimes it's things like trying to figure out how to make sure that stateless people get a passport from the UN or the international community. How do we get these folks documentation? But after we try to work out some of those stopgap protections and put some of those Band-Aids on those problems, the reality is we are going to keep coming up against these challenges because we have a structural problem at play, right? We're so focused on state governments and citizenship that we're going to keep having these protection gaps until we really address what's going on here. And so I argue that we have to expand our notion of citizenship to include political space for those who cannot be neatly categorized. How do we protect folks that don't have this functioning relationship with the government and or don't have legal status? They're still human, so how do we step up for them? I end the book by saying that only by recognizing that hierarchies of personhood exist and that every person is worthy of rights to place and purpose can we move forward with filling the protection gaps that threaten human dignity. And I think that at the end of the day, that's what this is really about. It's about recognizing human dignity and personhood and acknowledging everybody as being fully human. And I will stop there. Thank you. And if you're doing Christmas shopping, there's a rebate code on the book. Have to say that before the movie comes out.
Thank you so much, Professor Kingston. So I am moderating, but all that means is I get to help welcome questions and maybe do a little bit of traffic directing if we have a lot of questions. But I'm just looking forward to having a wonderful conversation with the people in this room and our guest. Welcome, everyone.
Hi. Thanks for the presentation. So you said now the UNHCR like require the states to have citizenship for anyone in the states, but it's not like the functional citizenship as you want to see. Do you think now there is like an effort for having a new legal framework to mandate states to have like functional citizenship to anyone who's born in the states, to end stateless?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's really difficult because more structural issues, right? So if we're thinking about human rights, these are rules that the international community places on governments. But the UN is made, first and foremost, to protect state sovereignty. It's in the UN Charter. So basically the UN says, don't worry, we are committed to not telling you what to do. So human rights are all about telling governments what to do, but we're not supposed to tell governments what to do, so button heads from the very beginning, right? And the policies related to citizenship, the policies related to governments deciding who does and does not belong in a state, it's like the ultimate act of sovereignty. And so I have a hard time imagining a world where any country, but especially the powerful countries, are going to be okay with the UN telling them who they have to make a citizen. So, I think that's where part of it comes into how we tell these stories and shedding light on some of this. I mean, I've been working on statelessness now for a long time, and I think most average folks still don't even know it exists. It's not kind of in our faces. We might have an idea what a refugee is, but not a stateless person. And I do think that part of it is political will and putting pressure on states to do better. I'm not sure forcing them is going to get us very far, because we're probably going to end up with what we ended up with in Kuwait, these blank pieces or these useless pieces of paper just to get, the international community off of our back. But in terms of functioning citizenship, I mean, you only have that if there's that mutual respect, and that's going to be a lot harder. It's a good question, though.
No, you go ahead, first. Will everybody introduce themselves too? I apologize, I didn't ask. Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Abdul. I'm from Kuwait too.
Oh, wow, wonderful. Thank you.
I'm Susan Akram, the director of the Human Rights Clinic at BU Law School. So I'm struggling with how the concept of functioning citizenship actually advances the obligations, the rights obligations of states. It's not a legal concept, it's not grounded in law. I'm not sure how it gets us farther than the statelessness obligations and the enforcement of the 9 core human rights treaties, which apply to people everywhere regardless of their status. Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to move from your concept to actual holding states more accountable, and I don't see it.
Right. The lawyers always hate me. I know. This is true. The lawyers always hate me. Because, okay, forgive me for what I'm gonna say next, but the law doesn't fix everything. And it's not going to fix this. And because it comes back to that sense of mutual respect, right? You can have all kinds of laws, but that is not going to, you're never going to get to the point where you can enforce this legally. I think the law is really important. You have to have those standards and norms. You have to have them. But that in itself isn't going to be enough, which is exactly why the UNHCR campaign is never going to be enough to eliminate statelessness. So it's not so much about trying to force governments to give functioning citizenship, because that's not a forcible thing. But I think rather it's a way of forcing us to look at things a little bit differently and to try to look outside the box. So rather than relying on legal status alone, I think we have to start questioning, what do we do with folks that don't fit into those categories or that it doesn't apply to? So, one of the things that we keep talking about is how do we provide documentation for folks that cannot access government documentation and are maybe never going to be able to access government documentation? Do we issue statelessness passports the way we used to issue the Nansen passports during the World Wars, right? Do we have some sort of documentation for folks who are indigenous or nomadic, who are either unable or unwilling to associate with the state government? Is there a way to be able to, and it sounds weird, but to document them as human beings in a sense, rather than as being affiliated with a state government? I don't know exactly what that would look like, but I think those kinds of questions are really, really important for the international community, because right now we're putting all of, not just the responsibility, but all of the power in the hands of states to do this, and they're either unwilling or unable to live up to those obligations in a lot of cases.
So I guess the question is, to whom is this addressed? If it's not going to be states, and obviously the UN is made up of states, so it doesn't matter if I agree with you.
Right.
The question is, how do you bring it about if there is no legal obligation that's attached to this?
Right.
That's the real
Right.
question.
And that's what I'm trying to get at, and I have a whole chapter about representing these issues and trying to kind of build political will, because I do think these conversations are really important, and yet, again, people don't know that this is happening. And it's not just regular people, by the way. So when I wrote my doctoral dissertation at Syracuse University, I interviewed decision makers at the major human rights NGOs in the United States. And I can't tell you exactly what they were because of IRB, but the big ones, okay, the ones you would think of. And I spoke with the heads of these organizations, so the people who were making decisions about what campaigns that they were going to focus on for that year or for that 5-year period. And almost across the board, I quickly realized I couldn't interview them about why they did or did not focus on statelessness, because not only were they not focusing on statelessness, they had no idea what statelessness was. And so these were important people whose whole lives were dedicated to human rights who had no idea what this meant. So here I am as a little PhD researcher explaining to very important people this idea. And so I do think that building that political will is really important. So, I mean, maybe it is going to be state members of the United Nations who are laying this out, but right now they don't really have a lot of motivation to do so, because nobody's paying attention. Nobody knows what it is. Here in the United States, we have something really interesting happening. We have a group of stateless people who really intentionally flew under the radar because they were afraid of being deported or put in detention, and so they were very quiet. And then the Trump administration came to be, and they thought, this is going to happen to us no matter what. Whether we're quiet or we're loud, we're in real danger here. And so they organized, and they founded an organization called United Stateless. And so you can look them up online. They're doing amazing work. And they have been putting the pressure on the US government. About a year ago, the Biden administration declared that they were going to start working toward having a statelessness determination procedure. Here in the US, we don't have that, and most countries don't have that. So even though stateless people are entitled to protections, we don't have any legal way to recognize you as a stateless person in the United States. There's no process. So you can say I'm stateless, and I'm like, okay, unless you have something else to tell me, I don't know what to do with you. So just having these determination procedures is huge. And the only reason that's happening is because you had a group of people putting pressure and telling that story. And you know, this is a new thing. That the procedure doesn't exist yet, but there is action toward it. And I think more and more that those sorts of things are going to make a huge difference in the lived experiences of these people who are vulnerable.
Yeah. Thank you for this. Actually, this
Introduce
kind
yourself.
of, Noura Lori, I'm an assistant professor of international relations here at the Pardee School. Thank you. I'm so galvanized after this. Could we go back to the slide that had like statelessness versus functioning citizenship? I appreciate this. That one. Sorry.
This one?
No, the one right after it. I think where you have the yes,
one?
that one. Perfect. I mean, this follows on Susan's question, and I think we're all kind of working on these same issues and coming to them and all agree, right? And your work really resonates for me because I was like, yep, forcibly displaced, irregular, indigenous, and then I just, have like temporary statuses, so people who are in temporary humanitarian protection for long periods of time or temporary labor status. So I think theoretically we're really aligned, and I know that this matches a variety of the International Human Rights Clinic's different projects, right? You guys have the statelessness mapping, you have missing migrants on the U.S.-Mexico, or Mexico. So this becomes a question of like, what the different methods, and I think that we use, and something about your process, and I think especially as a political theorist, it looks differently than a lawyer or a comparative.
Right.
Comparative political science is what I do, and I know that we have graduate students in the room who might be thinking about their dissertations. I mean, I think what you said about IRB and interviews, that's usually, don't expect to see that from a political theorist, and I feel like you're doing this innovative work. Yeah, if you can say something about, you know, the aha moment. How did you get into this? How did you like sort of connect these disparate cases, right? We're talking about Canada, Brazil, Rwanda, Myanmar, Serbia, right? They're speaking to each other across the globe.
Yeah.
Oh man, how to explain how I turned out to be such an interdisciplinary weirdo. Okay. Well, I mean, I had a very roundabout way of getting here. You know, I started out as a journalism major because I loved writing and I loved telling stories and talking to people. And I do think that has served me really well. I mean, for the students in the room, become good writers, because people can't write and it's really hard to get your ideas across, even if you're brilliant, if you can't write. But for me, I earned a master's degree from American University in DC before going to Syracuse. And I was on a summertime trip to Thailand with Julie Murtis, who's a human rights lawyer. And we were there looking at issues related to human trafficking. You know, Thailand has a lot of issues associated with human trafficking and forced prostitution and all sorts of things. And I was up in the north, and that's the first time I met stateless people. And it blew my mind. It never, ever occurred to me that somebody could be stateless. It was outside the realm of possibility. And I met these folks who were just kind of stuck in a holding pattern. They couldn't do anything. They couldn't go anywhere. And we forget, you know, we think about human rights violations as being like physical violence, but we forget about the violence of not being able to just live your life, like sitting in a camp every day, just bored out of your mind. That's a kind of violence. It's a torture. I met little kids I worked with little kids who really had been almost abandoned by their parents because they couldn't feed them. And yet these kids also couldn't go to school. They couldn't be adopted because they didn't have birth certificates. I mean, it was just a terrible, terrible situation. And so I came back to the US. I started trying to get more information about statelessness and realized there wasn't any. And so I went on to get my PhD, and I spent a lot of time thinking about issue emergence and why it is that we pay attention to certain issues and not others. And then I think I got involved looking at things like forced migration. I was studying at Syracuse University, which is right next door to the Onondaga Nation, so I had a lot of indigenous people in my life. So kind of part of it was just like my life experiences connected these things, and I started to realize this isn't unrelated. I will admit that when I was writing this book, I worried a lot that it was completely unrelated. I kept stopping and saying, does this make any sense? Is this just me? Am I crazy? But it's resonating with people. And I have a lot of folks, stateless people that show up at talks or indigenous people that show up that say, no, this is a thing. This is how I feel, and this does make sense. And so I think we're onto something in the sense that these communities are not necessarily fighting it alone, that they do have more connections than we realized.
Hi.
Hi. So I wanted to ask...
Introduce yourself, would you?
Oh, yeah. Hi, I'm Gideon. I'm an undergrad.
Hi.
I wanted to ask about your idea of functioning citizenship. So you mentioned when you're talking about irregular migration that there were some people who migrated because they couldn't rely on their government as a duty bearer because the government was too weak, etc. I wanted to ask if that means sort of as a general principle that areas that lack state capacity also lack functioning citizenship, and what that kind of means for a policy approach, because that seems to tie into just generally creating state capacity worldwide, which is enormous.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that is definitely an issue. I mean, we talk about countries that are failed states, and is it really reasonable to expect them to be efficient and capable duty bearers if they don't have functioning lots of things, right? So if you have citizenship to Somalia, what is that going to mean in terms of your everyday lived experience? You know, we talk about things like the power of passports, and there's actually agencies out there that rank passports based on how many visa-free countries you can enter, and companies that get paid a lot of money to organize additional like second or third citizenships for folks who want to do business in other countries. So I think the international community recognizes the value of having a powerful citizenship, and people who have the means go through a lot of expense and trouble to make sure they have those things. But I think that you're right in a sense. We think about failed states as being security risks, right? A lot of terror cells have wonderful spaces to do their awful business in failed states because we don't have the military infrastructure or their surveillance to prevent that from happening. But I think that we can also think about them in terms of global instability because of the forced displacement that they create and the global protection gaps that they create. So the reality, though, is that the people that are suffering the most, the citizens or would-be citizens of these states, don't necessarily have the political power to make much of a fuss about it, and they're not the priority of the international community in many cases. But that suffering is definitely happening there because of that. Does that answer your question? Kinda.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Anisha. I'm an undergraduate at Boston University. Thank you so much for the presentation. I wanted to ask, you mentioned how when doing this type of research, direct conversations are really important, but at the same time, sitting down and asking these people to talk about theories is tone deaf. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to ask, how were you able to kind of navigate these conversations and still get information that was relevant to the arguments and the theories mentioned in your book?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really good question. Part of it, I think, is, well, like I said, I love to travel, and my traveling isn't always a research project. So sometimes I just go into a community to get a sense of what's happening there. It takes a while. It takes a while to get people to trust you enough to talk to you in the first place for a study like this. I'm very interested in writing a book about the lived experience of statelessness in the United States. But I know it's going to take years of relationship building before these folks are going to trust me enough to sit for an interview, and I can't blame them, right? It's a lot, there's a lot on the line. So I think, yeah, I mean, one of the things about doing qualitative social science research, which is what I do, it's more just like discussion-based, interview-based, is you can't go in already knowing the answer to your question. You have to go in with an open mind, an idea that you're really there to have these people teach you about what they're experiencing. And it's hard, right? I mean, we go in, we have things we want to find out, we have things we're kind of convinced about, we have strong feelings, we're passionate. So it's hard to just be like, I'm going to go in and shut up and just hear what people have to say. And I like to talk, so it's really hard for me to shut up. But that's what you have to do.
Hi, I'm Isabella Trombetta. I'm a postdoc here at the Center for the Study of Europe, and I have so many questions. It was super interesting, but I will stick to two. The first one is, I guess, related to your question, and is how did you balance your journalism background with the ethics of research? Because they're two different, they're connected, but they're very different ways of approaching vulnerable population and approaching research in general. So that's my first question. And then my second question is, I was very interested when you spoke about the categories that don't fit in boxes, because that's a little bit connected to what I'm studying right now. I focus on maritime borders, and I'm fascinated by the category of boat people, which is what I'm studying right now. So I guess my question is, how did you grapple with categories that are not defined in law, which not very many are in international law, and which did you choose for your book?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, good questions. All right. So in terms of balancing the journalist side of me with the researcher side of me, I think that's a really good question and a really important one. And so I'm very careful in my writing to be aware of which interviews I cite that are on the record, so to speak, right? So for those of you who are just starting out, before you can go and do any sort of formal interviews, you have to go through a whole ethics board process, which at the time might seem like a real hassle because it's a lot of work, but it's really important because you don't want to do harm, especially if you're talking to somebody about human rights violations. You don't want to re-traumatize them or inadvertently put them in harm's way by having your notes stored somewhere or putting information in a paper that can be traced back to them. So I am really careful about that. I spend a lot of time quoting other scholars. Maybe I quote too much. I had somebody tell me that on a paper recently. It's like, it's the journalist in me. I'm always looking for the good quote. But I think there is a lot of storytelling that doesn't necessarily have to be about a particular person, but rather telling the story of a group or an experience. And that part, I think, is really important. And then once you want to get into quotes and specifics, that's when you have to make sure you have the IRB and you go through all of that. Right now I'm working on a project I'm really excited about. It's about Black African international students who were studying in Ukraine when the war started. And so they were displaced and had to figure out how to get the heck out of places like Kyiv. So where did they get their information from? How did they make those decisions? So I'm working with a student researcher on that, and those are very formal interviews. They have all of the documentation and everything. They sign off on it to protect their privacy, and we're going to make sure nothing in that paper can be traced back to them. So I do think it helps a lot. I think that I have nothing to compare it to. I've always been me, but I do feel like I maybe look for aspects of the story that sometimes other scholars don't. I spend a lot of time thinking about framing, and that comes up in a lot of my work, how maybe some issues don't get much attention in the international community because people just haven't figured out how to tell the story yet. So I think that's part of it. As for these groups that are not recognized by international law, it's really hard. It's really, really hard, especially because these groups people in these groups don't all have one set opinion. It's not like one person speaks for all. Working on Indigenous issues, especially as a non-Indigenous scholar, is really, really complicated, and I'm constantly afraid that I'm going to make a misstep because my intentions are good, but I'm not Indigenous, and I don't claim to be, and I think it's really important that I'm not the voice for these folks. But that said, I can talk to 20 Indigenous people from one particular Indigenous nation and get 20 different opinions, just like in any political community. And so trying to study groups that don't have, one particular stance is really, really hard. I think the best you can do is just, again, listening to what they have to say and also pushing back against that legal pressure to put everybody into boxes. Those boxes often don't fit.
I have a question, and it's kind of pushing...
You have to introduce
Oh,
yourself.
yeah. Right. So the Center for the Study of Europe director. I think I failed to introduce myself at the beginning. I want to push Susan's question and Nuda's question a little bit, because I often fantasize about being a political theorist, being able to push concepts and unpack concepts. And political theorists are a part of political science that really work often in the realm of ideas. And only some political theorists are like Professor Kingston and actually interview people and engage in empirical work. So you're a very innovative political theorist in that way. But you still do get to really shape concepts, and so that's what's so exciting about this. So I accept, and I really believe your answer, and I think there's valid there, your answer to Susan about you're trying to change ideas and awareness. So it sounds like the way you're pushing, solutions is a strong word, but path forward, it sounds like it's agenda setting, changing and shaping ideas. And it seems to me, and I really want to pin you down, my question's going to be like a counterfactual. Like, what would you actually like to see happen? So it sounded to me like one thing was conceptual, that actually, if you were in charge of the world, you'd like to see the UN not pursue stupid projects, like, yay, we checked off this goal, aren't we great, international community, to create these paper passports or these pieces of paper, right? So that sounds like something tangible you'd like, is to pull back some of the stupidity and some of the self-congratulation on that level. Maybe I get to say this and you don't have to, but then it sounds like the other area you were promoting was what I would call administrative reforms, around information, procedures, information collection, kind of a little bit of the market side about supply, right? But then as a political scientist, I share Susan and Nuda's comment of, states are both the consumers and the suppliers of this good. And so we can fix the supply side a little bit with better informational procedures and maybe better concepts, but there's still this huge sticking point of the fact that these laws, these norms, these rules these institutions were all created at the moment of peak state power in mid-20th century. And so what is a counterfactual out of that? What if, say you had a glass of wine in your hand and you were, not writing an academic book chapter, what's a counterfactual? What would it take? Like, what would a scenario look like to change
Drink
that?
a couple bottles of wine and fix the UN. That's what I'm going to do. Stay tuned, folks. Well,
I'm encouraging you to be a little dangerous.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I blush at the fact that you called me a political theorist, because I fit in such, I'm kind of all over the place. So the political theorists don't see me as one, right? But then the really hardcore, like field work, qualitative researchers also don't see me. So I'm all over the place. I'm very interdisciplinary, if you haven't figured that out. Thank you. I appreciate that very much. No, I think these are really, really good points. And I think, oh my gosh, if I wanted to, to fix this problem, well, first of all, I want to say, I'm really clear in the book that we're aspiring towards something. And I think it's important to kind of shoot for the moon and aspire to things, even if we know we're never going to fully get there. I hate to say that, but we're never going to ever get to the point, I'm sorry, that we don't have human rights violations and everybody's happy all the time. It's not going to happen. Maybe that's not in human nature. I don't know. That's a whole other philosophical conversation for another day. But I do think there is value in partly reforming the system, right? Some of those stopgap things. But I also think that this focus that we had, the pinnacle of state power that you were talking about, I do think that the bloom is off the rose. Is that the right expression? I think we're really realizing that states aren't going to be able to handle the load, the burden that we've placed on them. And now, especially with things like climate change happening, where we're having governments literally, or countries literally disappear off the map, we're going to have to face some really tough questions about what to do with folks who no longer have a government, who no longer have a territory. And we are not equipped to do that. We do not have the tools, we do not have the language to have that conversation. So do I think states are ever going to just say, oh, okay, I'm going to give up power and we're going to have, this world government or something like that? No, I mean, I'm realistic. That's not going to happen. But I do think that we need to have some sort of categories out there for folks that don't fit that. And I don't know what that's going to look like. I wish I did. So I'm pretty honest that I don't know. One of the things that I'm working on right now is a book about the ways that citizenship can be used as a weapon. So really going against this idea that citizenship is always the solution or it's always a social good, and looking at the ways that ID cards and citizenship can be used against us. So like giving the gift of American citizenship to indigenous populations, not because the American government liked them and wanted them to be part of the mix, but because they really wanted to privatize and take their land, stuff like that. And so I think the story of citizenship and what that means is important. Now, to be fair, if anyone from the UNHCR is watching, I don't think that the global campaign to eliminate statelessness was a stupid idea. I think it was fundamentally flawed, and the reason for that is because this is damn hard, right? Like, we genuinely don't know how to fix this, and so I think there are a lot of smart people who are grappling with this, and we're all in agreement that we want to fix this, but how to do it is really, really difficult.
Yeah, I have a comment on that.
Yeah.
I think the UN was successful to represent those who are not fit in sport, like with the refugees sport teams.
Yeah.
During they participate in the Olympics and like sport events with the UN flags. Mm-hmm. But other than sport, I share your concern.
Yeah.
That, like, there's
Yeah.
a way to represent.
Yeah.
Like without avoiding the states representing.
Right. Hi. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Allison. I'm an undergrad at BU. And I'm just really interested, obviously there's a lot of different types of statelessness that you described. I understand that there's not like a singular approach, but do you think like addressing the different types of statelessness will require individual approaches because they are so different, or is there like a holistic, comprehensive way to address this issue?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so it's tricky. So under international law, statelessness is when you do not have legal citizenship. So a lot of these folks are not stateless. They have citizenship somewhere, it's just not functioning, right? But even, so that's one whole can of worms there. But then even within people who are stateless as in under international law, we have a lot of different things going on. So people are stateless for a whole lot of reasons. So it could be that they are denationalized because they're seen as enemies of the state, like with the Rohingya. It could be that their countries just dissolved. I have a friend who is here in the US studying English, and the Soviet Union collapsed and her country just didn't exist anymore, and for a variety of reasons couldn't go back. And so she's been stateless in the United States ever since. I know another person who was actually a Holocaust survivor, came to the United States and had refugee status, and then had a drug charge back during the war on drugs. And so they stripped him of his green card. And now he's an old man who's stateless. His siblings are all US citizens because they were born here in the United States. And he can't access things like Social Security because of this. So there's all these different reasons. And so there's no magic bullet solution here because people are stateless for all sorts of different reasons. But things like having access to documentation, I think having some sort of ramifications for states that use statelessness as a weapon is really important. We tend to think about genocide as being physical violence, but there's all this other stuff that's wrapped up in that. But you're right, I think that's part of why it's so hard to tell this story. In my dissertation, I talked about one of the things that was kind of causing a problem for statelessness is that there's no CNN factor. How do you tell the story in a minute and a half on television or online? You can't. It's too complicated. And so that's part of the reason why we just kind of blend it together. Like, oh, refugee statelessness here. That's kind of the story. It's really, really hard.
Elizabeth, you had a comment.
I was just going to ask about the categories of human rights versus the rights of citizens. And are those useful to you, or do you see them in conflict? Because we have these inalienable rights that you outlined. And I think we all agree that you have those by virtue of your humanity.
Right.
But then, clearly, citizens of Massachusetts have a lower tuition at the University of Massachusetts, but because they're a citizen of this state, and the citizens of New York have to pay more.
Right.
So there are different kinds of rights that we have as citizens of different places, and some places have a better package of rights, so to speak, and so I'm just wondering, how do you think that citizen rights are valid, or should we only be talking about human rights, or do you also see some usefulness to this idea of having rights by virtue of the place where you live and pay taxes?
It's a good question. Well, so one thing I'd say from the start is it's really important to remember that human rights are really bare bones basic protections. So there's a difference between, say, human rights and social justice. I would say that none of us are going to be content if we only have our fundamental human rights protected, right? So think about education. Under international law, you have the right to a basic education. So things like literacy, learning how to read, having basic math skills, but that's it in terms of human rights. So things like the right to go to college or to have low interest rate student loans, like none of that's human rights. It's social justice though. So I would say in a society that has resources like here in the United States, we can all agree that offering kids a 5th grade education is not enough. We want to up that ante. And so we can talk about social justice and equity when it comes to that. But human rights are really bare bones kind of stuff. But you're right in the sense that there are a lot of rights associated with your citizenship and your tax paying and all of that. I mean, we have these kind of hierarchies even with school systems. In the United States, funding for public schools is associated with property taxes. So that means wealthier places with more expensive housing, they're going to have more money for schools. And so this does become an issue at the fundamental human rights issue, because there are some first graders who have way more opportunities than other first graders. And so that's a problem from human rights. there are scholars like Laura Van Was, who's over in the Netherlands, who works on statelessness, and she says that there are a lot of human rights that are really, citizenship rights that are dressed up as human rights. And so one really good example of that, I think, is political participation. You can say you have the human right to political participation, but are we really going to let non-citizens vote in our elections or run for office? No, of course not. That's not going to happen. And so it's a little bit tricky there. And Elizabeth Cohen, again, who's joining the faculty here at BU, talks about semi-citizenships. You know, we have limits on citizenship for children or for people who are in prison. They don't enjoy all the same rights as citizens because we decided they're not worthy, or because we, no offense to the 5-year-olds, I don't want 5-year-olds voting, okay? It's a bad plan. My niece would vote for a dinosaur for president. It's not going to work out. And so we do have differences in how some of these rights play out in practice.
Anyone else? Hi.
This is a bit more of a specific question, but I come from a family of immigrants, and a lot of them here that moved to the U.S. kind of came voluntarily. They weren't like fleeing war or violence or anything, but they were seeking out economic opportunity. But I do have undocumented family members now, and I'm kind of curious, do you think that people that kind of fall under that guise where they kind of made the voluntary choice to come here, so they're not necessarily like forcibly displaced or living in an involuntary limbo, should they be granted the same like functioning citizenship if they chose to put themselves in that disposition?
It's really hard. And you know, the reality is, I also come from a family of immigrants and refugees, and the reality is that most people want to stay home. You know, I hear so many folks say, oh, American dream, everybody wants to come to America. No, most people want to stay home, but they have to leave for a variety of reasons. My grandfather never wanted to leave Sicily. He complained about the weather in Michigan till the day he died, okay? But under, you know, the Refugee Convention, you have to be fleeing a well-founded fear of persecution, right? So not just bad things happening at home, but we have to be able to say that you as an individual are at risk, right? So like they're coming for you because of your ethnicity or your family background or whatever. So they're not going to qualify for asylum. But what you're pointing out, I think, is the real crux of the problem, is that just because they don't qualify for asylum under the Refugee Convention doesn't mean they didn't have really good reasons for moving. It doesn't mean that they weren't suffering from that lack of functioning citizenship that I'm talking about. And I think, unfortunately, your family members are falling into these protection gaps here, where they really couldn't stay home, but now they're kind of being punished in a way because they came to the U.S. without going through the right procedure. To be fair, there probably was no legal procedure for them to come to the United States. It's not like, oh, they just were lazy or they didn't want to wait in line. There's no line. Right? And so that's one of the many reasons why the U.S. immigration system is really, really broken. So I'm sorry that they're going through that. It's really difficult.
But if I can then make the leap and take the conclusion from the discussion that I agree with, is that the lack of boxes requires for the creation of more boxes and bigger international protection that recognizes situations that are not necessarily part of the international treaties or the conventions or various declarations. Because, or you pointed out, I don't know if that's the case, but that's one of the biggest areas, the economic migrants. Economic migrants are only a category that exists in academia or in public speaking, but it's not a category that is protected or identified in any way.
Right,
so.
right.
Well, and I also think it's interesting, you know, we focus so much about what happens at the border when people cross borders, but definitely don't spend enough time thinking about, well, how do we make life better at home so there is functioning citizenship and people don't have to leave their houses? How do we prevent forced displacement or migration or whatever we're calling it here? Because, again, a lot of people, most people, don't want to move in the first place.
Yeah, so I guess I'm still struggling with how functioning citizenship helps us, because when you're really talking about it, you're still coming back to the notion of statelessness, which I understand, which is defined, and which actually is defined broader than I think you're recognizing it. The definition is under the that a person is stateless if they are not recognized as a national under the application of any state's law.
Under the operation of its law, right?
Exactly. So that doesn't mean that formal nationality or citizenship is sufficient. In fact, the definition incorporates all of what you're saying already. And we know this because we're doing this mapping across the Middle East and North Africa, country by country, to identify the gaps, and this is in response to the UNHCR's challenge for reducing statelessness by 2024. And what we're finding is that the law really addresses what we need. It's the application of that law. And that in fact, all of the examples that you've set out, we are identifying and showing how state action is required to fix all these different applications of the gap in protection, but it's the gap in protection relating to the nationality versus statelessness legal definition. And that has to do with Bedouin, nomads, indigenous populations, children who can't access documentation, barriers to documentation, ISIS wives and children, for example. I mean, all of these we can map, and we have a solution. The recommendations are precise, they're related to the law. So I'm still struggling with how does functional citizenship help us?
I'd be very interested to hear your data because there are a lot of inherent problems with mapping statelessness. So people like my colleague Heather Alexander spend a lot of time talking about this and the fact that the law often doesn't capture instances of statelessness. It's really difficult to do that. But if we're talking about, first of all, I'm not making the case that all of these people are stateless, right? I'm making the case that they're in some ways limited in their functioning citizenship. But really, statelessness is all the way over here. Most of the people here are not going to be considered stateless. I don't think that statelessness mapping is going to be covering, for example, the Onondaga Nation, where people hold Canadian or American citizenship, have access to all of those rights and protections, but don't feel like that is adequate in terms of claiming their identity. So I think it depends. And again, there are going to be people that this cover. But I think that, again, I think it's naive to think that the law can force a government to provide fully functioning citizenship in a relationship. How do you prove that? That's not something that you can prove with a passport. And so a passport's a good start, right? I want everybody to have that documentation. We know that things like having birth registration is really important for accessing rights. But the reality and lived experiences, those things can be taken away at the whim of a government.
So if I can, tell me if I'm understanding you correctly. So I think what you're saying is that you're creating a framework or a spectrum in a way. Not to say one's better or worse than the other, but some kind of framework where statelessness is on an end, but you're kind of creating a maximalist definition and expanding out that spectrum of degradation of rights that exists in statelessness, but extending them into other categories.
So think about this as the hierarchy of personhood, not a spectrum of statelessness.
But then what you're suggesting then, because I think I very well understood that part, but then I think what you're suggesting is administrative and conceptual reforms to other categories that might, in some way, and you're more humble than saying you know the answer, but that might aggregate towards eventual statelessness. Solutions is too strong of a word.
Right.
But something that might shape statelessness agenda setting or something like that. But you're extending out the concept beyond statelessness in order to potentially challenge and shape the solutions that might or may not exist.
Yes, but it's not really about extending statelessness. It's about extending citizenship, right? The concept of citizenship. So again, I'm not claiming that all these people are stateless in some way. I'm arguing that their citizenship isn't fully functioning. So, but I think statelessness is a really useful concept because it kind of shows us like this is an illustration of what this looks like in real life.
On one end of a spectrum of
citizenship hierarchy. Right.
Can I jump in? Although I saw Gideon has. Sorry we get excited. Cut off the student. But But just, kind of following up on like what Susan and Kai were just saying, I think like this comes back to what you were saying, what I was asking about, like what is our role in each one of our capacities in the way that we're thinking and drawing upon. And I think, you mentioned like you're in between theory and more qualitative work, and I think, when a political theorist that gets recognized as a political theorist, they're often depending on previous texts of thinkers, right? That's what they're deeply engaging with. And so what I like about your work is that's not the basis. The basis is these human experiences. And I think in terms of like what is required of all of us that we don't have haven't been doing enough of is like a reimagining of the global order, right? Because all of this comes down to the state-centric, right? So even the question of whether states can be impelled during law or can you map these gaps, like we're still within the cul-de-sac of thinking of states as the solution to a problem that is a state-made problem, right? This is
right.
And we've had some conversations of attempts to like, oh, well, what are other actors? Well, private companies are huge actors, but then do you think of like the private sector as being potential partners in reimagining this global order?
Do we want the corporations?
Do we want the corporations? On the other hand, they're already doing it, right? Like with this selling of citizenship, that's the marketization. So yeah, can we tax these citizenship by investment schemes to provide rights for refugees? That's a crazy idea, and so I think that we're all in the realm of like, in doing this work, I think what's required of us is actually to sort of push our thinking for how to reimagine this really state-centric.
And because all of our education and our work is rooted in the state system, and then to say, oh, but we have to think beyond it, and it kind of makes our brains explode. Because we don't have the capacity to do that. And also we have to be realistic about, we're not getting beyond the state system anytime soon. So kind of how can we use this as a thinking exercise to get closer to what we want, but at the same time being practical about it. Yeah, I agree with you.
So I had one to ask this question may be linked to what y'all were just talking about, but also it's the first question I wrote down from your talk.
Okay.
So it might be earlier. But I wanted to ask about, so you're talking about governments as duty bearers, and there's also, in 2005, there's the responsibility to protect norm development. So does that turn the UN into a secondary duty bearer for these human rights norms? Is that a functional base for to build off of, or is that just going to end up back where we started? Is there a way to strengthen that norm in a way that would make it more useful?
It's another beautiful idea, the responsibility to protect, or R2P, but it hasn't been working out so hot. And actually, my colleague Jeff Bachman has a great book that just came out about the politics of genocide. And he talks about how permanent members of the UN Security Council have really sort of gamed the system to make sure that they're never held accountable for genocide in all sorts of ways. And he talks about R2P and the fact that this is not really, it is not something that can be leveraged very effectively, but rather it's kind of a tool for some of these powerful countries to make themselves look good or to punish less powerful states. And so it really hasn't been living up to its potential, which is a shame. For those of you who don't know what R2P is, it's basically an international norm that says that countries that basically countries can't be bystanders to things like genocide and ethnic cleansing, mass atrocity crimes. So if you have the ability to intervene and stop these things from happening, it is your obligation to do so within the international community. But again, right, we're working in the UN, so if you intervene in a country's domestic affairs, that's basically declaring war on that country. So when is this going to happen? Interestingly enough, it's almost always liberal states like France and the United States who throw around R2P, like we're going to invoke R2P. It's not countries like China and Russia who are very much not wanting the international community to get involved in domestic affairs. But it really, hasn't worked out, right? So for example, there's a lot of talk about how RTP should be invoked in Syria during the civil war, and of course Russia wasn't going to let that happen. So in theory, this would be a great idea for filling some of those protection gaps, but in practice it just really hasn't panned out.
All right. I didn't see anyone else starting to raise their hand or anything like that. I just wanted to give everyone an opportunity. Oh,
Yeah,
please.
Yes. I was going to say that RTB was used as justification of intervention in Libya in 2011, and instead of protecting human rights, created destroyed the state, basically
Right.
was bombed,
Right.
destroyed all the infrastructure, and then it's like now a hub of refugees crossing the Mediterranean to Italy or France. So I don't think it's like a good way to.
With Libyan militias being paid by European countries to turn back refugee boats. Yeah, exactly. So kind of a human rights cover for other things. Yeah.
All right. So thank you for your wonderful talk. Please join me in